The morning was crisp, the sort of early October air that lent itself to reflection rather than activity, and Inspector Purbright found himself once again standing outside the modest vicarage of Little Hemsby, a neatly folded letter stamped in a careful hand and edged with the faintly perfumed scent one associated with formal correspondence had been delivered the previous afternoon. It bore the signature of the Reverend Clemente Hartwell, whose duties in the parish were often marked by a surprising blend of conscientiousness and mild eccentricity. The letter requested in phrases of deliberate civility that Purbright might examine at his convenience a matter of minor pecuniary and social disturbance concerning the chapel door, which had been inexplicably locked outside of service hours. Purbright surveyed the brick facade of the vicarage, noting the pale ivy that had begun its slow march over the window frames. A small brass plaque gleamed in the sun, announcing the Reverend's presence with an almost ceremonial precision. The inspector's eyes then roamed to the chapel itself, a low, squat building of warm red brick, its modest spire barely visible above the surrounding elms. It was, as one might expect, impeccably maintained, a testament to decades of routine, pride, and the careful scrutiny of those for whom appearances were an existential matter. As he approached the gate, Purbright was met with a procession of parishioners, all converging upon the chapel for the morning prayer service. Their manner was measured, faces carefully neutral, as if each had rehearsed the art of appearing punctual yet unconcerned. Murmurs rippled through the small gathering, yet every remark was suffused with a cautious civility, a polite hedging against impropriety. An unusual circumstance, one elderly lady remarked to her neighbour, lowering her voice so that only a half-inch of sound might escape her lips. "I trust the vicar shall explain." Purbright inclined his head politely, but said nothing. Experience had taught him that initial inquiries were best made without comment. He noted the subtle arrangement of the assembly. The committee members positioned themselves according to long-standing hierarchies, the widows of the parish in one corner, the farmers' wives in another, all creating a living map of unspoken social alliances. He took a particular interest in a middle-aged gentleman, Mr. Grantham, whose half-smile suggested both mild amusement and the faintest trace of disapproval. The vicar appeared at the chapel door, a figure of composed dignity. He carried with him a single key, turned it in the lock with an almost theatrical care, and allowed a faint sigh to escape, as though the mechanics of entry were a personal trial. "Good morning, Inspector Purbright," he said, his voice carrying the practised tone of formality one reserves for matters of consequence. "I trust your journey was unobstructed." "Quite so, Reverend," Purbright replied, inclining his head. His eyes, however, lingered on the slight twitch of the vicar's left hand, a detail trivial to anyone else, yet, in his experience, often indicative of a lingering irritation or suppressed frustration. Inside, the chapel maintained its customary stillness, a quiet sanctum preserved through decades of disciplined ritual. Sunlight fell in measured patterns across the polished pews, illuminating dust motes as if to remind all present of the passage of time. Purbright's attention, however, remained on the congregation. He observed their subtle cues, the deliberate smoothing of gloves, the discreet adjustment of collars, the faint clearing of throats before speaking. Every action was designed to project orderliness, yet he detected the slight tension that suggested latent curiosity, or perhaps unspoken judgment. "The door," the vicar began, in tones that suggested both apology and mild reproach, "was found locked this morning in a manner inconsistent with our usual protocol. No harm is done, yet it raises questions of propriety. One hopes such anomalies may be accounted for without undue consternation." He paused, allowing the words to settle. Purbright noted that the congregation nodded, not with unanimous agreement, but with the cautious precision of those unwilling to display either confusion or dissent. As the service commenced, the inspector remained alert to the minor dissonances, a cough held too long, a gaze that lingered just beyond what was socially acceptable, the faint rustle of paper as parishioners consulted personal notes. It was, in essence, a performance of tranquillity, and yet Purbright could sense the silent vibrations of anxiety beneath the surface. The locked door, trivial in itself, had become a locus for wider concerns, questions of authority, responsibility, and the perennial struggle between civility and concealed resentment. Following the service, Purbright lingered in the vestry while the parishioners dispersed, exchanging murmured remarks with the faintest undertones of reproach or speculation. The vicar stood nearby, straightening his vestments with the precision of a man accustomed to control. "The committee will meet this afternoon," he remarked, almost as an afterthought. "There are no doubt matters to discuss." Purbright inclined his head. "You suspect internal disagreement?" he inquired, his tone neutral, allowing the question to hover without insistence. "Merely differences in perspective," the vicar replied. His gaze flickered toward the window, as if measuring the exact angle of light upon the pews. "It is not uncommon in small communities for trivial issues to assume disproportionate significance." Purbright made a mental note. Trivial, indeed, yet he suspected that such incidents often served as proxies for grievances far subtler than the casual observer might perceive. He allowed a brief silence to pass, during which the faint scent of beeswax and old books filled the vestry, a sensory reminder of the parish's long adherence to routine. Later, as he strolled toward the village square, Purbright observed the small shop where Mr. Crimble, the postmaster, sorted letters with the deliberation of one handling both correspondence and reputation. The inspector noted how Miss Hatherley, a committee member, paused by the counter offering an oblique inquiry about the locked door, carefully phrased to avoid the appearance of curiosity. "One trusts no impropriety occurred?" she asked, her voice pitched with the faintest tremor of anxiety beneath the veneer of politeness. Purbright smiled inwardly. The subtlety of such inquiries, the careful dance of propriety, was a language he knew well. Here, reputations were not merely maintained, they were performed, endlessly rehearsed and subtly policed by the community itself. One could almost chart the social terrain by observing who asked what, and with what degree of hesitancy or emphasis. The inspector spent the afternoon walking along the lanes that bordered the chapel, noting the small signs of social engagement. The careful pruning of hedges, the exchange of polite nods, the whisper of gossip held just beyond earshot. Each observation added a piece to an invisible puzzle, the edges of which were defined less by crime than by the intricate negotiations of civility. Even the village cat perched on a low wall seemed a participant in these silent conventions, regarding him with a measured disinterest that mirrored the village's own. By the late afternoon, Purbright returned to the vicarage, finding the Reverend examining his ledger with a careful intensity that suggested both diligence and preoccupation. "I have instructed the committee to assemble promptly," he said without looking up. "It is prudent, I think, to discuss the matter openly, yet discreetly." Purbright inclined his head. "Discretion often reveals more than force," he remarked, allowing a wry, imperceptible inflection to convey the observation without breaching the boundaries of propriety. The vicar, finally looking up, offered the faintest of smiles, one that conveyed both acknowledgment and the slightest trace of unease. Outside, the light had begun to soften, and shadows stretched across the garden path in measured, almost contemplative patterns. Purbright, reflecting on the day's observations, understood that the locked door was less an anomaly of hardware than a mirror of human temperament, pride, suspicion, and minor resentments all manifesting through ritual and restraint. As he left the vicarage, a small figure lingered at the edge of the hedge, observing him with a cautious, almost imperceptible interest. The individual's identity was unclear, their purpose even more so. Purbright felt, with that familiar blend of satisfaction and mild curiosity, that the first layer of the mystery had been unveiled, not in dramatic revelation, but in subtle gestures, polite hesitation, and the faintest tremor of human disquiet. He walked down the lane, the village quiet now except for the occasional rustle of leaves, and considered the implications. There were no dramatic confrontations, no overt malice, only the slow, intricate play of reputation and propriety, a theatre of civility in which the smallest gesture could carry disproportionate meaning. And as he passed the chapel once more, its door firmly locked but unthreatening, he could not help but note the faintest hint of a question hovering silently in the autumn air. Who among these courteous and practised faces had turned the key, and why? The morning in Little Hemsby arrived with the understated dignity of a village untroubled by the wider world, yet Inspector Purbright found it ripe with subtle disturbances. He began at the vicarage, where a small stack of correspondence had been placed on the polished sideboard, neatly arranged in order of delivery. Each envelope bore the careful hand of a writer, attuned to the gentle dictates of civility, inked flourishes, precise margins, and a scent faintly reminiscent of lavender sachets. These letters, Purbright quickly discerned, were not mere pleasantries or routine notifications. They were complaints, veiled and courteous, concerning minor grievances that nevertheless carried an air of grave significance. "Good morning, Inspector," said Reverend Hartwell, rising from his chair with measured civility. "I fear these documents may appear trivial to outsiders, yet they weigh heavily upon our small community. One must consider the subtle injury to reputation, even in matters that seem, at first glance, inconsequential." Purbright inclined his head. "Reputations are, in small communities, exceedingly delicate," he replied. "A slight misstep, or even a perceived one, may ripple far beyond its apparent significance." His tone suggested neither judgment nor surprise, merely observation. The vicar gestured toward the letters. "You will see the elegance of grievance in each missive. Note how civility tempers discontent, how social expectation restrains the expression of irritation, yet between the lines lies a tension most illuminating." Purbright read with meticulous attention. One letter from Mrs. Penhaligon, widow of the late parish treasurer, noted with precise politeness that the flower arrangements in the chapel did not reflect her understanding of the agreed scheme. Another from Mr. Grantham, a man Purbright had already marked for his habitual subtle disapproval, contained a carefully worded concern that the recent reordering of hymn sheets could disrupt the proper conduct of services. There were no overt accusations, no sharp exclamations, merely the patient, calculated insistence that tradition be maintained and that each slight be observed, catalogued, and in due course rectified. Over tea the inspector noticed that the vicar's serene composure carried a faint undercurrent of tension. His hands, though steady, tapped intermittently against the side of the cup, a rhythm so subtle that it might have passed unnoticed by anyone less attuned. "One finds," Hartwell said in tones deliberate and reflective, "that civility itself can become an instrument of scrutiny. A polite complaint carries with it the force of a reprimand when handled with proper circumspection." Purbright allowed a small nod, accepting the observation without comment. He knew well that the weight of observation, of minor criticisms administered with impeccable manners, could far outweigh any act of overt confrontation. It was, in essence, a slow, socially sanctioned form of judgment. The inspector's attention then turned to the margins of the letters. In each one could detect the telltale hesitations of writers constrained by propriety, slight overuse of underlining for emphasis, minuscule corrections, and the careful repetition of phrases designed to reinforce moral rectitude. These details, Purbright reflected, revealed more about character than the central complaint itself. Here, in the minutiae of ink and paper, lay the subtle interplay of envy, pride, and the need for social ascendancy. Mid-morning brought a visit from Miss Hatherley, the committee's youngest member, who arrived with an invitation to the upcoming autumn fête. She moved with the deliberation of one keenly aware that politeness might mask suspicion and perhaps a dash of impatience. "Good morning, Reverend Inspector," she said, placing the envelope on the table with precise care. "We trust all arrangements will meet with your approval, though the committee is most eager to proceed without misstep." Her voice, though ostensibly warm, carried the faintest edge of expectation, as though she wished to signal loyalty while hinting at potential criticism. Purbright observed her closely. Her polished manners were a deliberate construction, one designed to forestall censure, while simultaneously asserting her perceptive engagement with parish affairs. He made a note to watch for how she interacted with other committee members. Subtle hierarchies often revealed themselves in the smallest of gestures, the briefest of exchanges. Miss Hatherley departed, and Purbright turned once more to the letters. One, less formally addressed and written in a slightly tremulous hand, suggested that certain parishioners felt overlooked in the allocation of seating for morning prayers. There was no rancour, merely the careful phrasing of grievance, designed to leave no one offended while still insisting that attention be paid. Purbright smiled inwardly. Civility in Little Hemsby was rarely accidental. It was performed with the precision of ritual, and each performance carried its own measure of subtle reproach. He spent some time walking the short path between vicarage and chapel, noting the signs of social negotiation that extended beyond correspondence. The garden was tended with almost ceremonial care, each hedge trimmed to a precise angle, each flower bed aligned to an unseen standard. A neighbour paused to adjust the angle of a sundial, acknowledging his presence with the faintest nod, careful neither to overstate attention nor to neglect it. Even in these small domestic acts, Purbright discerned the same pattern he had observed in letters, an ongoing, intricate management of reputation and perception. By noon he returned to the vicarage, where Hartwell had begun making notes in his ledger. "The letters," he remarked, tapping the stack with a delicate forefinger, "suggest a community divided not by malice but by concern. Yet such concern often transforms into subtle friction when unspoken loyalties and expectations collide. The chapel door, in its minor irregularity, has become the emblem of these tensions." Purbright allowed a brief pause. "Symbols often carry more weight than deeds," he observed, "especially when everyone is acutely aware of how others perceive their actions." The vicar inclined his head in agreement, eyes fixed on the patterns of light across the polished floorboards. "Indeed, it is remarkable how a single mechanical act, a locked door, a misplaced key, can provoke reflection, debate, and even silent judgment. One might almost say it tests the moral compass of the parish without overt declaration." In the early afternoon, Purbright paid a visit to the post office. Mr. Crimble, aware of the inspector's scrutiny, displayed his usual mixture of formal politeness and gentle amusement. Letters were sorted with deliberate attention, and Purbright noticed how envelopes destined for the vicarage were handled with a kind of ceremonial care. Miss Penhaligon, the widow, entered during his visit, casually inquiring after the chapel's recent irregularity. She phrased her questions with exquisite courtesy, yet the tilt of her head and the slight narrowing of her eyes suggested an unspoken curiosity about the vicar's motives. Returning to the vicarage, Purbright reflected upon the subtleties of village life. Civility, he thought, functioned as both veil and instrument. It obscured resentment even as it revealed hierarchy, and each small breach of expectation became magnified into a question of moral propriety. In this environment, he mused, the locked chapel door was not merely a mechanical anomaly, it was a mirror held to the conscience of the parish, reflecting minor rivalries, concealed anxieties, and the persistent negotiation of reputation. Before leaving for the day, Purbright made a quiet observation. On the vicar's desk lay a small, folded note, apparently overlooked amid the more formal correspondence. It was neither complaint nor request, merely a brief remark of thanks, yet the handwriting was unfamiliar. The note's presence, understated yet deliberate, suggested a new element in the social interplay, a party hitherto invisible, whose attention to civility was both timely and measured. Purbright, familiar with the ways in which reputations were quietly policed, felt a familiar prickle of curiosity. Who had left it? And more importantly, why now? He departed the vicarage, the late afternoon light soft upon the village streets. Shops were closing, a few parishioners lingered by the fountain exchanging muted pleasantries. Every face, every gesture seemed to contribute to a delicate tapestry of observation, caution, and social negotiation. Purbright's mind traced the invisible threads that connected correspondence, committee meetings, and casual inquiries. The locked door had not yet revealed its full significance, but already it was clear that a complex web of attention and subtle rivalry had begun to form. As he walked toward the hedge-lined lane that led out of the village, Purbright's eye caught a fleeting movement, a shadow crossing the vicarage window, swift and deliberate, yet not intrusive. He paused, noting only that the timing coincided with the arrival of the anonymous note. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps something more deliberate. The question, delicate and understated, lingered in the cool air. What in a community so assiduously polite could compel a villager to act outside the bounds of routine? And what would such an act reveal about the intricate balance of small-town life? With that, Purbright continued his measured journey, aware that the day's minor disturbances had provided the first real threads of inquiry. Each letter, each gesture, each carefully constrained observation offered a whisper of insight. And though no scandal had yet emerged, he sensed the faint stirrings of a mystery that would unfold not with violence, but with the quiet persistence of civility, scrutiny, and the inescapable weight of reputational expectation. The parish committee convened in the vestry of Little Hemsby Chapel at precisely 3 o'clock, each member arriving with the decorum expected in a room devoted to civic, if not ecclesiastical, administration. The table was polished to a reflective sheen, and the minutes of the previous meeting lay neatly aligned before each chair, their corners meticulously squared. Inspector Purbright entered quietly, his presence acknowledged with polite nods that were at once courteous and measured, revealing just enough acknowledgment to satisfy propriety while concealing the faintest trace of curiosity. The vicar, Reverend Hartwell, presided at the head of the table, his hands folded lightly over a ledger. "I trust we are all prepared to discuss the morning's irregularity," he began, voice calm, his gaze sweeping the assembled members with the precision of one accustomed to both observation and subtle control. "It is, I assure you, a minor disturbance. Yet its implications for our order and reputation merit attention." Mrs. Penhaligon, widow of the late treasurer, cleared her throat delicately. "One does hope, Reverend, that we may consider all factors," she said, glancing briefly at Mr. Grantham, as though the two were jointly custodians of propriety. "Small matters, if neglected, may reflect upon our stewardship in ways unintended Her words were careful, the polite understatement belying a sharper, habitual vigilance toward ritual correctness. Purbright, seated at the periphery, observed. The committee's interactions were a choreography of civility. Nods punctuated with barely perceptible hesitations, glances directed sideways yet constrained, corrections offered with gentle insistence rather than abruptness. It was a social dance, and he had learned that the steps, however modest, revealed the underlying alliances and fissures with remarkable clarity. Miss Hatherley, the committee's youngest member, spoke next. "I wonder if the incident might be attributed to simple oversight," she suggested, phrasing her words with a delicacy that allowed room for dissent. Her tone carried no accusation, yet the faint lift of her eyebrows hinted at the possibility of a more subtle cause, one that did not involve mechanical error but human judgment. Purbright made a mental note. Such a phrasing was often the harbinger of investigative interest, a way of signalling observation without the risk of overt critique. Mr. Grantham, his spectacles slightly askew, interjected with the same careful courtesy. "While oversight is possible, we must not disregard the potential reflection upon the parish's order," he said. "Even minor deviations, if left unexplored, can erode confidence." He smiled faintly, a smile that suggested both adherence to duty and mild disapproval of any suggestion that oversight alone could explain irregularities. The vicar nodded, allowing the remarks to settle. "It is precisely for such reasons that transparency is necessary," he said. "Though the event is minor, its interpretation is indicative of our collective responsibility. One cannot ignore the subtle signals that arise from a breach of routine, however modest it may appear." His emphasis on collective responsibility elicited a ripple of attentive nods. Purbright noted the precision with which the phrase was received, as though each member had absorbed not only the meaning, but the social weight attached. Discussion turned naturally to the flower arrangements, whose placement that morning had been noted in one of the letters Purbright had reviewed. The debate was exquisite in its restraint. Mrs. Penhaligon suggested that the dais should be shifted slightly, Miss Hatherley proposed an alternative alignment of the hymn books, and Mr. Grantham commented on the necessity of maintaining symmetry. Every observation was phrased in terms of decorum and respect, yet Purbright could detect an undercurrent of rivalry. The flower arrangements, he reflected, had become a symbol, small gestures upon which subtle judgments might be affixed. A pause ensued, filled only by the gentle ticking of the vestry clock. Each member adjusted papers, folded hands, or cleared a throat, but the silence was anything but empty. It was a space in which reputations were silently policed, in which minor expressions, an arch of an eyebrow, a tightening of lips, served as commentary on the propriety of others. Purbright, accustomed to such atmospheres, allowed his eyes to wander subtly, noting the fleeting exchanges, the carefully measured gestures, and the small, almost imperceptible signs of alliance and unease. At this moment, a brief murmur arose from the back of the room. One of the older committee members, Mr. Latchford, leaned forward, peering through spectacles perched on the tip of his nose. "Might we also consider," he began, with deliberate pacing of words, "whether the morning's irregularity could reflect a matter of personal inclination? One wonders if individual predilections may influence the maintenance of our sacred routines." The statement, polite yet pointed, caused a subtle shift in attention. The vicar's eyes flicked momentarily to a folded letter on the table, one that Purbright recognized as the anonymous note from the previous day. Miss Hatherley's hands, folded lightly, betrayed a momentary tightening, a subtle signal that her attention had caught upon something of significance. Even Mr. Grantham, ever careful with propriety, allowed a slight frown to crease his forehead, a minor, almost imperceptible deviation from his otherwise immaculate demeanour. Purbright made a quiet observation. In the absence of overt accusation, the group's collective gaze had moved almost imperceptibly toward matters unspoken. The locked door, trivial in itself, had become a focal point for these discreet assertions of judgment. It was a lens through which the parish measured conduct, weighed intentions, and evaluated character, all without ever straying from the bounds of politeness. The discussion resumed, now turning toward practical arrangements for the coming services. The vicar suggested minor adjustments to the order of hymns, which elicited nods of cautious agreement. Miss Hatherley proposed an amendment, phrased as a question rather than a correction, ensuring that the suggestion could be received without offence. Mr. Latchford offered a final, gently worded reminder about punctuality and the allocation of roles, signalling attention to both detail and hierarchy. Purbright noted that these ostensibly mundane matters were treated with the gravity of high policy. Each phrase, each deferential preface carried the subtle weight of social scrutiny. It was not that anyone wished to be disagreeable, rather each was engaged in a careful negotiation of propriety, wherein failure to observe etiquette could result in reputational diminution. Even the smallest gesture, a polite cough, a measured smile, a strategic pause, served as a marker of one's standing within this meticulously ordered society. Toward the conclusion of the meeting, the vicar addressed the matter of the locked door once more. "I trust that all parties will exercise due care in ensuring that such irregularities do not recur," he said. The statement was soft in tone, almost conversational, yet its implications were precise. Oversight was forgivable, intentionality less so. Purbright observed the flicker of expressions in response, slight tightening of jaws, a brief glance toward the door, and the subtle adjustment of seating positions, small, silent communications, but revealing nonetheless. As the committee rose to depart, Purbright allowed his gaze to linger on Mr. Grantham and Miss Hatherley, who exchanged a fleeting look, neither openly conspiratorial nor entirely neutral. The observer might have missed it, but Purbright, trained in the subtleties of small-town manoeuvring, noted the careful modulation of interest and attention. This glance, almost imperceptible, suggested that one or more members were now entertaining questions previously left unspoken. The vicar, noting the dispersal, gave a mild smile of courtesy to the inspector. "Your presence, Inspector Purbright, has been illuminating. One rarely perceives the full texture of committee deliberations without the benefit of your perspective." His words, though gracious, carried a nuance. The acknowledgement that scrutiny, even gentle and civil, could shift the balance of confidence. Purbright inclined his head. "It is always instructive to observe civility in action," he replied, voice calm, allowing a hint of wry amusement to remain unspoken. Politeness, after all, often conceals as much as it reveals. As he departed the vestry, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the chapel floor, Purbright reflected upon the subtleties of the day's observations. The locked door, initially a simple curiosity, had emerged as a symbol, a mirror reflecting the hidden anxieties, latent rivalries, and careful moral calibrations of the parish. Every gesture, every carefully phrased remark, suggested a network of attention and observation as intricate as any formal investigation. Passing the edge of the vicarage garden, Purbright noticed a small scrap of paper tucked beneath the flower-bed edging, almost invisible but distinctly out of place. It bore a few handwritten lines, evidently penned with care, though the handwriting was unfamiliar. The content was cryptic, a question, a remark, and nothing more. Yet even this minor anomaly, trivial in its immediate import, carried with it the quiet potential to illuminate, if only subtly, the web of civility and vigilance that had been revealed so meticulously in the vestry. He pocketed the note, a faint smile of anticipation curling beneath his composed exterior. In Little Hemsby, as he knew well, it was often these smallest, almost inconsequential details that hinted at the larger dynamics of intrigue, moral vigilance, and reputational anxiety. The question lingered, delicate and unresolved. Who had placed the note, and what, in a parish so devoted to propriety, could compel its discreet insertion into the pattern of daily life? The sun had begun its descent behind the gentle rise of Little Hemsby's hedgerows when Inspector Purbright set out upon his afternoon rounds, his purpose quietly observational rather than interventionist. The village in this late hour possessed a peculiar calm, shop shutters lowered, chimneys exhaling thin wisps of smoke, and the occasional footfall upon cobbled lanes sounding almost ceremoniously against the hush. Yet within this quiet lay an undercurrent of subtle anticipation, an awareness, unspoken but pervasive, that something unusual had disturbed the customary rhythm of the parish. Purbright's first call was upon Mrs. Penhaligon, whose recent letters had so delicately expressed concern over flower arrangements and minor seating allocations. She greeted him with the immaculate politeness of one ever mindful of appearances, yet her eyes, bright with calculated attentiveness, betrayed the faintest trace of lingering curiosity. Tea was offered in precisely measured portions, biscuits placed on the saucer in careful symmetry. "One hopes, Inspector," she remarked, "that your observations will not unduly trouble Reverend Hartwell. The chapel, after all, requires delicate stewardship." Her phrasing suggested more than concern for decorum. It hinted at a protective vigilance over her own social position. Purbright allowed a soft nod, accepting the invitation to speak, but offering no premature conclusion. "It is often in small matters," he replied, voice calm, "that the subtler qualities of stewardship reveal themselves. A locked door, a misplaced flower, even the allocation of pews, these may carry significance beyond their immediate appearance." Mrs. Penhaligon inclined her head, as if to acknowledge both the truth of his observation and the tacit possibility that she herself had been implicated, however indirectly, in any perceived irregularity. Purbright noted the careful straightening of her gloves, the gentle adjustment of her lapel, each gesture serving as a marker of propriety and of self-conscious scrutiny. From there he proceeded to Mr. Grantham, who, as Purbright had already observed, carried a habitual blend of mild disapproval and fastidious attention. Grantham's parlour, with its high-backed chairs and polished mahogany, was arranged with the precision of a display rather than a living space. A single portrait of a long-deceased ancestor hung above the mantel, eyes following one's movements with an almost judicial attention. "Inspector Purbright," Grantham began, rising with deliberate formality, "I trust your visit is one of inquiry rather than censure. One must be careful in discussing matters that may reflect upon communal reputation." Purbright smiled faintly, noting the careful phrasing, and permitted a pause before speaking. "Inquiry is often inseparable from observation, Mr. Grantham. One discovers much from the manner in which individuals frame their concerns, even when framed politely." Grantham allowed a subtle exhalation, a tiny concession to the inspector's insight. Yet his posture remained rigorously composed. "Indeed," he said, "the chapel's irregularity, while seemingly minor, illuminates much about the vigilance we must exercise, both toward ritual and toward one another." He offered tea, precisely poured into fine china, the cup's placement mirroring an unspoken insistence on exactitude. The inspector's visits extended to Miss Hatherley, whose youth and apparent deference masked a keen attentiveness to social hierarchy. She received him in a drawing-room where sunlight pooled upon meticulously arranged cushions. Her hands, folded lightly in her lap, betrayed a subtle tension, one of engagement, observation, and the faintest hint of expectation. "I trust the committee's deliberations have been satisfactory, Inspector?" she inquired, her voice courteous, yet suggesting a silent test of his attentiveness. Purbright, noting her carefully modulated phrasing, inclined his head. "Satisfactory, perhaps, but revealing," he said. "One observes as much in the silences and hesitations as in the statements themselves." Miss Hatherley allowed a faint smile, one that acknowledged understanding without overcommitment. "The parish is a delicate organism," she said. "Even minor disturbances may reflect deeper undercurrents." She leaned slightly forward, in a gesture that was more observation than invitation, signaling awareness of subtler dynamics at play. Purbright, in turn, noted the slight tightening of her fingers upon her lap, an almost imperceptible signal that curiosity and discretion were in careful balance. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had traced a subtle network of attention and concern. The locked door, once a simple procedural curiosity, had begun to reveal itself as a locus for observation, judgment, and minor rivalry. Each household presented a distinct approach: the meticulous vigilance of Mrs. Penhaligon, the controlled scrutiny of Mr. Grantham, the cautious perceptiveness of Miss Hatherley. In each, the same pattern emerged: a concern not merely for ritual propriety, but for social positioning and reputation. His route continued to the post office, where Mr. Crimble sorted letters with the precision of someone aware that his work, though ostensibly mundane, formed the connective tissue of village observation. Purbright noted the small gestures, the brief glance to ensure no envelope was out of place, the slight adjustment of spectacles, the careful, measured nod to a passing acquaintance. Here, civility operated as a surveillance of subtlety, a policing of propriety as rigorous as any formal regulation. A brief conversation with a shopkeeper revealed additional nuance. "Most unusual," she remarked quietly, arranging jars upon the counter. "A locked door has not caused scandal, but it has given some pause. People speak politely, of course, yet there is curiosity. One wonders whether oversight alone can explain such a thing." Her phrasing, hedged yet pointed, suggested both propriety and private speculation, an interplay Purbright had long learned to read with precision. Later, he wandered along the lane beside the chapel, noting the angles of light on the stonework, the slow rustle of leaves in the hedgerows, the faint echoes of voices in distant gardens. Each detail, though trivial in isolation, contributed to a composite understanding of village life, a rhythm of attention, of subtle hierarchy, of observation under the guise of normalcy. The locked door had begun to function less as an object and more as a mirror, reflecting human concern, latent rivalry, and the quiet assertion of propriety. As the afternoon waned, Purbright returned to the vicarage. Reverend Hartwell was seated by the window, ledger open, eyes tracing the carefully maintained accounts. "Your observations, Inspector," he said without looking up, "appear to have extended beyond the vestry and committee. I trust the subtlety of our parishioners has not gone unnoticed." "Hardly," Purbright replied. "It is often in private spaces that civility is tested, and perhaps most revealingly expressed." He indicated, with slight motion of his hand, the flow of correspondence and the discreet attention each household paid to appearances. The vicar inclined his head. Indeed, the locked door, though minor, seems to have initiated a ripple of reflection throughout the parish. One might almost say it has exposed the very threads by which we bind ourselves socially. Purbright allowed a pause, observing the interplay of light and shadow across the vicar's desk. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted his gaze toward the window. There, beneath the rosebush at the edge of the garden, lay a small scrap of paper, half concealed and yet clearly placed with intention. Its presence was subtle, easily overlooked by anyone unobservant. The handwriting, unfamiliar, suggested a participant hitherto unseen in the quiet negotiations of propriety and expectation. The inspector picked it up delicately, noting that its contents were limited to a brief, almost cryptic remark, a question regarding morning arrangements, phrased with a civility that masked curiosity. It was a minor anomaly, yet it carried the potential to illuminate new patterns of attention, rivalry, and perhaps even intentional subversion. Purbright regarded the paper for a moment, noting the careful folds and the deliberate placement. In Little Hemsby, he reflected, even the smallest act could resonate through the delicate lattice of civility and reputation. Here, in this minor intrusion, lay a clue, small, almost invisible, yet pregnant with possibility. As the late afternoon light softened the outlines of the hedgerows and the chapel tower cast a long shadow across the lane, Purbright understood that the investigation, such as it was, had shifted from observation of mere irregularity to an awareness of subtle human calculation. The locked door was no longer simply a procedural curiosity. It had become a lens through which the complex interplay of vigilance, etiquette, and moral expectation might be discerned. He pocketed the note with measured care, aware that it marked the first tangible sign of intervention beyond the ordinary observances of civility. And as he stepped onto the lane, the sound of distant church bells echoing faintly, a thought settled lightly upon him. In a community so devoted to polite observation, who had taken the liberty to intervene in this way, and what subtle motive might have guided that act? By mid-morning, Inspector Purbright found himself seated at the vicarage desk, surrounded by a neat stack of parish newsletters freshly delivered from the printer. Each bore the familiar punctilious layout, a blend of announcements, gentle reminders, and carefully phrased commendations. The print itself was immaculate, type aligned with the precision one might expect from a man who considered legibility almost a moral duty. Yet, as Purbright had long learned, civility in text often concealed more than it revealed. Beneath the veneer of cheer and communal harmony, subtle currents of judgment and quiet admonition pulsed like an undertone inaudible to the careless reader. Reverend Hartwell, perched in his high-backed chair with the faintest crease of contemplation upon his brow, gestured toward the newsletters. One finds, he said, that written communication, though seemingly innocuous, may operate as both instruction and gentle critique. A well-chosen phrase may serve to preserve decorum while signaling expectation. It is, of course, the very definition of tact. Purbright's gaze swept the room, noting the immaculate arrangement of furniture and the faint smell of beeswax that lingered in the air. "And sometimes, Reverend," he observed, "the subtlest inflection in text carries more weight than spoken words. Letters and newsletters are repositories of both observation and anticipation. Civility can mask scrutiny with remarkable efficiency." The vicar inclined his head in measured agreement. "Indeed. I am reminded, in preparing this issue, of Mrs. Penhaligon's observations regarding flower arrangements and seating. One must acknowledge the gentle insistence with which she frames her suggestions, never overtly confrontational, yet impossible to disregard." Purbright turned to the first newsletter, scanning each section with the careful attention he had honed over years of observing small communities. Announcements of hymn schedules, committee appointments, and parish socials were interwoven with phrases of subtle commendation. "We are grateful to those who maintain the order and beauty of the chapel, reflecting our shared devotion." On first reading, these lines seemed innocuous, yet the choice of verbs, the selective acknowledgement of particular parishioners, and the absence of others suggested a careful calibration of approval and implied criticism. A letter to the editor section followed, printed with anonymity, which offered the most fertile ground for social insight. One entry, brief and punctiliously polite, noted that certain parishioners had been observed attending to their duties with admirable punctuality, though one hopes all may follow suit. The language was courteous, yet the implication was clear. Observation, even in minor matters, was being recorded, and lapses in propriety could not escape notice. Purbright allowed a faint smile. In Little Hemsby, subtlety was not merely a social grace, but a form of governance. Each letter, each carefully constructed phrase, served as a barometer of expectation, a signal that morality, decorum, and reputation were under constant, if unobtrusive, surveillance. His attention was then drawn to the personal correspondence included with the newsletters. Several letters were addressed to Reverend Hartwell, their content more pointed than the public notices, their civility perfectly maintained. One, penned in delicate cursive, hinted at dissatisfaction with recent committee decisions, phrased as a gentle suggestion for review. Another expressed concern over a perceived imbalance in recognition for services rendered, again, polite yet precise in its implicit reproach. Purbright reflected on the subtle economy of these communications. In a village such as this, no direct confrontation was required to exert pressure. Civility, attention, and written observation sufficed. It was a system wherein reputation could be shaped, questioned, or reinforced with nothing more aggressive than a carefully worded newsletter. Each sender had mastered the art of polite influence, knowing that the consequences of minor lapses in decorum were disproportionately potent in a community ever vigilant of appearances. A knock at the door interrupted his consideration. Miss Hatherley entered, hat held in her hands, voice poised between inquiry and courtesy. "Inspector Purbright," she said, "I wondered whether you had had occasion to review the latest issue. There are subtleties, perhaps, that might escape even the attentive eye." Purbright gestured to the newsletters. "Indeed, subtlety is the province of careful observation, Miss Hatherley. It is remarkable how even the most seemingly innocuous sentence may encode observation, critique, and expectation simultaneously." Miss Hatherley allowed a faint, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging both the observation and the implicit compliment in its articulation. "One hopes, of course, that such insights remain constructive," she said, the final word pitched with delicacy, as though offering reassurance while testing for confirmation. Purbright inclined his head. "In communities such as Little Hemsby," he remarked, "constructiveness and scrutiny coexist in a delicate balance. Letters, newsletters, and the smallest gestures maintain this equilibrium, often without need for overt admonition." Miss Hatherley, her attention momentarily shifting, indicated the committee section of the newsletter. "Notice, for example, how the selection of committee duties has been phrased," she said. "One might read commendation and caution simultaneously." Her hands moved with measured care to indicate the lines in question. "Those chosen for morning arrangements are praised, while the absence of mention for others implies expectation, if not gentle reproach." Purbright's eyes traced the lines. Indeed, the phrasing was a masterclass in subtle social management. Recognition and expectation were interwoven, and the absent names functioned as silent reminders of obligation, a signal that attention to duty and to perception remained both visible and morally weighted. He paused over a brief editorial, unsigned, which praised the vicar's diligence in maintaining order while hinting at the necessity of community attentiveness to minor irregularities which, if left unchecked, might disrupt the harmony we cherish. Civility, thought Purbright, had evolved here into a form of moral surveillance. It was not enforcement through rebuke, but through reflection, expectation, and the gentle, persistent weight of observation. Miss Hatherley departed with a slight bow, leaving Purbright to consider the quiet efficacy of the newsletter. Each paragraph, each careful word choice, carried the twin functions of communication and judgment, reinforcing hierarchy while preserving appearances. Civility operated not merely as etiquette, but as a subtle instrument of control and influence. Later, Purbright wandered along the lane adjacent to the chapel, carrying the newsletters with him, reading sections aloud under his breath in the gentle sunlight. The village in this hour seemed to hum with polite vigilance. Doors were ajar, but only just, as though even architecture participated in the choreography of civility. Window panes reflected the movement of those inside, each gesture contained, deliberate, and carefully measured. The newsletters, now slightly dog-eared in his hands, became both guide and lens, a record of public expectation and private judgment alike. At the edge of the lane, near the small parish notice board, Purbright noticed a faint impression in the gravel, a footstep, perfectly ordinary in itself, but positioned with a curious care, as though someone had lingered just long enough to observe without being seen. The detail was minor, almost imperceptible, yet in his experience such nuances were often the harbingers of intent, the first visible sign of intervention within an otherwise seamless social fabric. Returning to the vicarage, Purbright reflected on the day's observations. The newsletter had transformed from mere information into a subtle instrument of evaluation, an almost invisible thread connecting attention, expectation, and reputational anxiety. It was, he mused, a mirror in which the parish examined itself, its civility, its hierarchy, and its latent rivalries without ever departing from the bounds of polite society. As he placed the newsletters neatly back upon the desk, a single folded note slipped from between the pages of one issue. It bore no signature, only a brief, polite query. Was the door secured in proper accordance with procedure? The handwriting was unfamiliar, cursive and precise, a ghost of formal attentiveness. Purbright regarded it for a moment, noting the intentional anonymity and the carefully hedged phrasing. It suggested an observer watching not for scandal, but for compliance, someone invested in both civility and subtle accountability. He pocketed the note, sensing its potential significance. In Little Hemsby, he reflected, even minor interventions, small letters, whispered inquiries, or unremarked gestures could carry the weight of revelation. The newsletter had provided insight, yet this singular private message hinted at yet another layer of observation, a participant hitherto invisible in the parish's network of subtle scrutiny. Walking down the lane toward the vicarage gates, Purbright felt the familiar satisfaction of progress without disruption. The village remained calm, civility intact, reputations unscathed. Yet the day's reading, the minor observations, and the discovery of the anonymous note all suggested that the locked chapel door, trivial though it might appear, had catalyzed a quiet and intricate investigation, not one of malice, but of attention, moral expectation, and the careful choreography of human behavior. And as he stepped beneath the softening afternoon sun, a faint question settled upon him, unspoken yet insistent. In a community so meticulous about observation and propriety, who had gone to the trouble of leaving this note, and to what subtle purpose? The late afternoon light slanted across Little Hemsby's narrow lanes, casting the chapel in soft relief against the quietude of the village. Inspector Purbright approached the vestry with the careful attention of a man accustomed to the subtleties of observation. The day had been spent tracing correspondence, committee deliberations and social attentions, Now he sought insight into the quieter, more private rituals that bound the parish, rituals whose power lay not in grandeur, but in discretion. Confessional hours were a brief, carefully managed affair, yet Purbright knew that even here, beneath the veneer of piety and routine, the faintest tremors of social anxiety, moral vigilance, and reputational concern might be discerned. He entered the side aisle of the chapel, taking a seat near the rear, where shadows softened his presence. The smell of polished wood and beeswax mingled with the faint scent of incense, creating an atmosphere simultaneously solemn and intimate. Reverend Hartwell appeared soon after, adjusting the small latticework screen that divided the confessional from the rest of the chapel. His hands were steady, but Purbright noted the delicate flexing of his fingers, a slight tension barely perceptible, as though even routine administration required measured attention. "Inspector," he said in his usual measured tone, "you are welcome to observe, though one must respect the confidentiality of those who seek counsel, yet the manner in which one conducts oneself may reveal much, even when nothing is explicitly stated." Purbright inclined his head. "Observation need not interfere with propriety," he replied. "Often it is the silences, the hesitations, and the unspoken that speak most clearly." The first parishioner arrived, a woman of advancing years, her face composed and eyes averted. She knelt, murmured words behind the screen, and departed, leaving behind only the subtle echo of decorum. The second visitor, a younger man with the careful posture of someone who measured both appearance and action, lingered slightly before speaking. Purbright noted how the vicar's tone remained formal, courteous, and evenly measured, yet the briefest twitch of an eyebrow hinted at his awareness of underlying concerns. Even in these moments of intimate ritual, the inspector discerned the intricate interplay of reputation and moral anxiety. Each penitent presented a carefully curated self, aware of the boundaries of observation, yet inevitably revealing faint traces of personal inclination and social expectation. The confessional, thought Purbright, functioned less as a vessel for absolution than as a mirror of civility. Those who entered sought both spiritual guidance and tacit affirmation of propriety. Between visits, the vicar paused to make minor notes in a ledger, entries precise, handwriting small and deliberate. Purbright observed him from the shadowed aisle, noting how his attention to record-keeping mirrored the parish's broader concern for order. Even the most routine entries were executed with an almost ritualistic care, a signal that every act, however minor, was susceptible to scrutiny and interpretation. A brief interval followed, during which the inspector took the opportunity to note the body language of those moving quietly through the chapel. A committee member arrived, ostensibly to retrieve hymn sheets, and engaged in conversation with Miss Hatherley near the altar. Their dialogue was formal, phrased in the most conventional politeness, yet Purbright noted the subtle flourishes of attention, a slight tilt of the head, a careful placement of hands, an almost imperceptible pause before response. These minor gestures, he knew, were social currency deployed to maintain balance between scrutiny and courtesy. Later, Purbright observed Mrs. Penhaligon passing near the pews, stopping briefly to adjust a cushion before moving along as though asserting her stake in order and propriety through the smallest act. Even this silent gesture carried implication, a gentle signal of attentiveness, of moral vigilance, and perhaps of quiet disapproval toward those less meticulous. The vicar's confessional chair saw several more visitors in the early evening, each interaction revealing the same subtle dynamics. The inspector's attention rested less on the words spoken than on the rhythms of behavior, the careful modulation of tone, the fleeting glances that indicated awareness of social expectations, the precise navigation between humility and self-assertion. In these minute observations, the moral architecture of the parish emerged with clarity. Vigilance, reputation, and propriety operating in an almost invisible lattice. When the last penitent departed, Purbright took the opportunity to converse briefly with Reverend Hartwell. "It appears," he said, "that even private reflection is guided by the same networks of observation and expectation that govern committee meetings and correspondence." The vicar smiled faintly. "Indeed, Inspector, even confession, ostensibly an exercise in privacy and absolution, is conducted within the broader framework of civility. Parishioners carry an awareness not only of divine scrutiny, but of social expectation. And perhaps it is this dual consciousness that ensures the delicate balance of conduct within Little Hemsby." Purbright's attention was drawn, almost instinctively, to a subtle detail. A single sheet of paper folded and left beneath the confessional bench. He bent slightly to retrieve it, noting the careful folding and deliberate placement. It bore a brief message, typed and concise. "Observe the committee's arrangements tomorrow. Discretion is advised." There was no signature, no overt indication of intent, yet the note carried an unmistakable implication of oversight, interest, and potential intervention. The inspector pocketed the note, reflecting on the quiet significance of such an act. In a community so devoted to polite observation, even minor interventions could bear weight far beyond their apparent scale. Someone had taken the time to signal attention to arrangements without disturbing propriety, a gesture entirely in keeping with the village's complex choreography of civility. As the evening deepened, Purbright wandered among the pews once more, tracing the lines of polished wood and soft carpets with his gaze. The chapel, though empty, retained a quiet hum of expectancy, the echoes of conversations, the brief murmurs of confession, and the weight of observation lingered like a faint perfume. In these lingering impressions he discerned the faintest currents of rivalry, anticipation, and concern for reputation. At the door he paused to observe the angle of the vicar's ledger, the placement of hymn sheets, the careful alignment of chairs. Each detail, though trivial in isolation, participated in a larger system of moral and social governance. The locked door that had occasioned his visit, the newsletters, the letters, and the anonymous notes, all were now part of a subtle pattern, a network of observation in which civility, scrutiny, and expectation intersected seamlessly. Purbright stepped outside, the cool evening air carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and polished stone. The village remained quiet, yet he sensed that the subtle ripples of attention and expectation would persist into the night. Even in absence, the parish's vigilance extended through notes, gestures, and the unspoken memory of observation. The locked chapel door, minor though it appeared, had initiated a chain of scrutiny, revealing the intricate moral and social architecture of Little Hemsby. As he walked down the lane, his steps muted against the gravel, Purbright considered the note retrieved from the confessional bench. Who had placed it? With what intent? And more crucially, what did the selection of timing, wording, and context suggest about the hidden attentions of the parish? These questions, quiet and deliberate, settled upon him like the evening shadows, suggesting that beneath the smooth surface of civility there remained a network of vigilance and subtle ambition yet to be fully revealed. The inspector paused briefly, glancing at the chapel tower, silhouetted against the twilight sky. In Little Hemsby, as he had learned, it was rarely dramatic action or overt malice that revealed character. Instead, it was the patient, understated signs, the letter left in quiet corners, the glance exchanged between committee members, the modulation of politeness that held the key to understanding. And in this, he thought, the mystery of the locked door had become something more than a question of access. It was a lens through which the hidden motives, anxieties, and ambitions of a community might be traced with patient care. With that reflection, Purbright resumed his measured walk through the village, the faint outline of the chapel behind him, aware that each gesture, each unseen observer, and each carefully placed note formed part of an intricate tableau of civility and subtle intrigue. The day's confessions had offered no overt revelation, yet the presence of the anonymous note, careful, precise, and deliberate, hinted at a participant whose attentions might yet prove decisive. The question lingered, understated yet persistent, in a village so thoroughly polite, who watched from the shadows, and to what end? The following morning, little Hemsby awoke to a pale sun filtering through a high, slanted mist, giving the village a subdued, almost private quality. Inspector Purbright, mindful of the subtleties he had been tracing since the locked chapel door first attracted attention, chose to move among the parishioners informally, visiting those whose behaviours and statements had offered hints of divergence between word and action. His path led first to the carefully ordered gardens of Mrs. Penhaligon, whose previous letters had demonstrated a devotion to precision that bordered on ritual. She greeted him with a calm smile, gloves neatly folded over her forearm, eyes bright with deliberate attentiveness. "Inspector," she said, "I trust your observations have been fruitful, though of course discretion is always preferable in matters concerning the chapel." Her phrasing suggested both an acknowledgment of prior scrutiny and a gentle assertion of propriety. Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed, Mrs. Penhaligon, yet it is often in small, seemingly inconsequential acts that one discovers divergence between attention and intent. A gardener's hand, a misplaced cushion, a hesitant glance, each may speak more than words." She guided him through her flower beds, noting the precise alignment of tulips and chrysanthemums. Yet, as she spoke of her arrangements, Purbright detected a slight discrepancy between her words and her gestures. A bud tilted slightly, a border trimmed with uncharacteristic irregularity. Nothing overt, nothing to disrupt decorum, yet sufficient to suggest either distraction or deliberate placement. "Curious," Purbright remarked quietly, "how even perfect care may conceal slight variations. They are rarely accidental, I find, when observed in a pattern of otherwise meticulous attention." He allowed a subtle pause, letting his words hang between them. Mrs. Penhaligon's smile tightened fractionally, her hands momentarily still, as if reconsidering the narrative she had been constructing. From there, the inspector made his way to Mr. Grantham's residence, a stately property with a manicured hedge acting as a boundary, both literal and symbolic. Grantham received him in the drawing-room, polished to the point of antiseptic calm. Tea was served with mechanical precision, yet Purbright noted the brief hesitation before the first cup was poured, a pause that might easily be overlooked, but which suggested a conscious modulation of etiquette. "Inspector," Grantham began, "I hope your visit is not solely for observation. I would not wish to create discomfort through scrutiny." His voice remained courteous, measured, yet Purbright noted the subtle inflection of defensiveness beneath the surface civility. "Observation need not cause discomfort," Purbright replied, "provided one is attentive to nuance. Yet it is precisely in minor hesitations, in slight discrepancies between declaration and action, that one discerns a community's hidden patterns." Grantham inclined his head thoughtfully, returning to his ledger for a moment as though confirming that all variables remained accounted for. And yet Purbright noticed an almost imperceptible frown, brief, fleeting, when the conversation returned to morning duties at the chapel. Words and gestures, carefully composed, suggested minor tension, a fissure in what otherwise appeared flawless decorum. Later, in the quiet of Miss Hatherley's drawing-room, Purbright observed yet another subtle divergence between statement and gesture. She received him with her usual polite attentiveness, but her fingers tapped lightly against the arm of her chair, a rhythm too consistent to be idle, too deliberate to be unconscious. "Inspector," she said, "I trust the committee has been of interest, though I hope no conclusion is drawn prematurely from isolated observation." Purbright's gaze swept the room, noting the alignment of cushions, the precise angle of the window drapery, and the careful spacing of decorative books. "Indeed," he replied. "And yet, Miss Hatherley, it is the interplay between observation and subtle variation that proves most revealing. Even the most disciplined environment contains inconsistencies that suggest intention or distraction." She allowed a faint smile. "You are, as ever, precise in your phrasing. I suppose minor contradictions are unavoidable when one balances duty with observation." Yet her hands, still tapping against the chair arm, suggested a residual preoccupation with anticipation or disclosure. Purbright spent the remainder of the morning tracing these contradictions further, pausing briefly at the post office to observe the placement of letters and the circulation of newsletters. Mr. Crimble, ever meticulous, arranged correspondence with the same formal care, yet the positioning of a single envelope, slightly forward of the others, drew Purbright's attention. A minor deviation, almost imperceptible, yet one that suggested intentional emphasis. In the chapel yard, he observed parishioners exchanging polite greetings. Each nod, each slight adjustment of hat or veil, was executed with the care of practiced attention. And yet here too, Purbright noted tiny discrepancies, a foot not fully aligned with the cobbles, a gaze lingering fractionally longer than required. These minute divergences suggested private attentions, considerations not fully expressed in words, yet revealing in their rhythm and timing. Returning to the vicarage, Purbright was invited by Reverend Hartwell to inspect arrangements for the following service. Chairs were realigned, hymn sheets double-checked, and flower arrangements reassessed with careful hands. Yet, as the inspector traced the motions of each participant, he observed subtle differences between the stated intention and the execution: a misaligned hymn sheet, a bud slightly out of place, a gesture of adjustment offered to no one in particular. Civility remained intact, yet the undercurrent of minor discrepancy persisted, a delicate trace of unspoken divergence. In conversation, the vicar remarked, "It is remarkable how even the smallest deviations may influence perception. A minor misplacement may go unnoticed by some, yet weigh upon others more attuned to detail." Purbright inclined his head. It is, in effect, a silent conversation between expectation and execution, and often the quietest divergences reveal the strongest attentiveness or concern. As he prepared to leave, the inspector's eye caught a brief motion at the edge of the vicarage garden. A scrap of paper, half hidden beneath a trimmed hedge. It bore a single, precise question. Has the sequence been followed correctly? The handwriting was unfamiliar, the phrasing polite, yet deliberate. Purbright bent to retrieve it, noting the careful placement, as though the note's author intended it to be seen without creating overt attention. Such minor intrusions, he reflected, were far more informative than any overt confession. In a community so devoted to civility, the choice to communicate anonymously, subtly, and in measured terms revealed both observation and expectation. The note was an index of attentiveness, an assertion of moral and procedural awareness placed deliberately within the quiet rhythm of the parish. Walking toward the village lane, Purbright considered the series of minor divergences he had observed, slight misalignments in flower beds, momentary hesitations in speech, subtle differences between words and gestures. Each, taken in isolation, was negligible. Taken collectively, they suggested a lattice of attentiveness, rivalry, and moral concern. The locked chapel door had initiated this chain of observation, and now the anonymous note indicated that someone had begun to intervene in the network with intention, marking attention, and perhaps testing compliance. The late morning air carried the faint scent of autumn leaves, and Purbright's footsteps sounded muted upon the gravel. The parish remained outwardly composed, yet beneath the surface the silent choreography of observation continued. Civility, reputational vigilance, and minor scrutiny intersected in a complex pattern that was both resilient and revealing. As he paused at the vicarage gate, Purbright considered the anonymous note and the pattern it suggested. In Little Hemsby, subtle divergence between word and deed, between intention and action, had always been observable, but never so deliberately highlighted. The question lingered: who had placed this note, and to what end? Was it a prompt toward order, a challenge to authority, or simply a reflection of personal vigilance? The answer, delicate and indirect, would demand careful observation, patience, and attentiveness to nuance, the very tools Purbright had cultivated over a career spent discerning the intricate choreography of small-town morality. The inspector stepped onto the lane, the village stretching out in quiet order before him. Each hedge, each gate, each perfectly aligned cobblestone bore witness to the careful balance of civility and scrutiny. And in that balance, he thought, lay the key not only to the mystery of the locked chapel door, but to the network of subtle interventions, minor divergences, and understated attention that defined Little Hemsby itself. The morning had offered no overt revelation, yet it had provided the faintest, most telling clues. The silent, patient signals that suggested some unseen hand was guiding observation, if not expectation, with careful discretion. And as he walked, the inspector allowed a final, quiet thought to settle upon him. In a community so devoted to politeness and careful observation, even the smallest deviation, the tiniest intervention, might ripple outward, revealing more than words could ever convey. Who watched and why remained unspoken, but the question, understated and insistent, had already begun to shape the rhythm of the day. The evening air in Little Hemsby carried the faint tang of chimney smoke and the lingering warmth of a late autumn sun, casting long shadows across neatly swept lanes. The village hall, a modest brick building with varnished timber doors and polished windows, had been prepared for the weekly parish social, and the interior, though unpretentious, suggested meticulous attention. Inspector Purbright arrived with the quiet deliberation of a man accustomed to observing minutiae, noting immediately the alignment of chairs, the careful spacing of tables, and the faint but deliberate arrangement of refreshments, tea, biscuits, and a small selection of fruit, each placed to avoid offence or inconvenience. Reverend Hartwell, standing near the sideboard with a ledger tucked under one arm, greeted the inspector with a formal nod. "Inspector," he said, "one hopes your interest in social proceedings is limited to observation. The evening's purpose is, of course, communal enjoyment, though even here civility must be maintained." "Observation need not disturb civility," Purbright replied, his voice calm. "Indeed, it is often the quiet interplay of gestures, the slight variations in conduct, that reveal more than overt conversation." Already, the room exhibited the familiar patterns he had noted throughout his visits. Mrs. Penhaligon, hands folded, hovered near the refreshment table, arranging biscuits with deliberate precision and exchanging polite nods with each arriving parishioner. Each movement, while seemingly innocuous, carried undertones of authority. She monitored without intrusion, subtly influencing the order of the room. Her eyes, bright yet discreet, flicked toward minor deviations, a chair misaligned, a cup too far from the table edge, and the faintest twitch of her fingers suggested a quiet disapproval. Across the hall, Mr. Grantham engaged a small circle of parishioners in discussion, his tone measured, courteous, yet underlined by an unspoken insistence on correctness. Purbright noted the precision of his gestures, the careful placement of hands upon the back of chairs, the slow nods that punctuated statements, the brief hesitations that indicated awareness of social observation. Even in casual discourse, the interplay of propriety and expectation persisted. Miss Hatherley occupied a chair at the far corner, an observer rather than participant, though her attention never wavered. She traced the room's interactions with subtle calculations, tilting her head slightly, adjusting her posture to indicate both attentiveness and self-possession. Her glance toward the refreshment table, timed just as Mrs. Penhaligon adjusted a napkin, suggested an appreciation for ritual and subtle hierarchy, an unspoken acknowledgement of who wielded influence even in the most minor matters. Purbright, noting these patterns, allowed his gaze to drift over the room, cataloguing gestures, pauses, and minor deviations. Civility and attention were in constant negotiation, with reputation delicately maintained through minor interventions, polite correction, and strategic observation. Even the youngest attendees, though ostensibly innocent of hierarchical concern, displayed gestures of compliance, careful placement of chairs, unobtrusive movement around established social lines, and the occasional mimicry of adult posture. Conversation flowed in subdued tones, each participant aware of the weight of observation. Discussions of hymn arrangements, committee schedules, and flower placements were interlaced with cautious praise and understated admonition. Phrases such as, "One must, of course, remember our shared responsibilities," or "It is most commendable that attention has been paid," conveyed both approval and expectation, functioning as instruments of subtle guidance. At one point, Purbright observed a minor discrepancy. A cup of tea placed beside Mr. Grantham's chair was slightly misaligned, an oversight unnoticed by most, but noted by Mrs. Penhaligon, whose hand twitched toward correction before she hesitated and allowed the error to remain. The subtle restraint suggested awareness not only of propriety, but also of social observation, the interplay of correction and discretion forming an unspoken dialogue. Later, Purbright noted an exchange between Miss Hatherley and a younger parishioner. Words were spoken politely, carefully phrased, but the gestures betrayed a nuanced negotiation. A slight hesitation before reply, a tilt of the head, a hand lightly touching a chair back, all indicated unspoken communication, an awareness of observation, and the subtle influence of propriety. The inspector recorded each motion with mental precision, knowing that such minor behaviors often revealed underlying tensions, alliances, and expectations more clearly than overt conversation. Even the distribution of refreshments became a theatre of observation. Plates were shifted, biscuits offered, cups refilled with deliberate attention. Those who were praised for attentiveness received minor advantages, a slightly larger selection, the first offer of tea, while those less mindful were subtly reminded of their position through delayed service or careful spacing. In Little Hemsby, social currency was quantified not in words alone, but in these understated gestures, and Purbright noted them with the quiet satisfaction of one tracing invisible threads. Midway through the evening, a small commotion arose, not of anger or dispute, but of whispered observation. A parishioner remarked, in low, courteous tones, on the arrangement of hymn sheets for the following Sunday. The phrasing was careful, yet the underlying question whether proper protocol had been observed was unmistakable. Purbright's attention focused immediately. This was not mere discussion, but subtle inquiry, a polite test of compliance and attentiveness. The response, equally measured, reaffirmed both propriety and observation, without overtly acknowledging the query. As the evening progressed, the inspector became aware of another nuance, the presence of an envelope left deliberately atop the refreshments table, partially concealed beneath a napkin. He retrieved it quietly, noting the precise folding and lack of identifying marks. Inside, a brief note read, "Consider the sequence. Alignment matters as always." The handwriting, neat and deliberate, suggested someone well acquainted with both ritual and subtle oversight. The envelope's placement, almost hidden yet accessible, indicated intention, to be seen by one attentive enough without disturbing the outward calm of the social. Purbright reflected upon the note and its implications. Here was evidence of oversight operating beyond formal roles, a silent observer influencing behavior, reminding participants of expectations and reinforcing the lattice of social and moral scrutiny that defined the village. The locked chapel door, once a minor curiosity, had now catalyzed multiple layers of attention, stretching from newsletters and correspondence to gestures, conversation, and anonymous reminders. By the evening's conclusion, Purbright had catalogued subtle alliances, minor rivalries, and the interplay of discretion and observation. Mrs. Penhaligon's vigilance, Grantham's measured insistence on correctness, Miss Hatherley's observant detachment, and the anonymous note all contributed to a network of surveillance, influence, and propriety that transcended formal authority. Civility was the medium and subtlety the instrument. As he departed the hall, the inspector paused to consider the patterns he had observed. Even in absence of overt disruption, the parish social had revealed the intricate choreography of attention, expectation, and minor intervention. The network of observation, reinforced by gestures, glances, and small anonymous acts, persisted as a quiet mechanism of control and moral guidance. Stepping onto the lane, Purbright allowed a final glance back at the hall. The lights inside flickered warmly against the darkening sky, the laughter and polite conversation now distant. In Little Hemsby, he reflected, even the smallest act, a note, a glance, the alignment of a cup, could ripple through the community, revealing loyalties, anxieties, and unspoken rivalries. The locked chapel door, trivial though it appeared, had become a catalyst for observation and subtle intervention. And as the inspector walked away, the anonymous note still in his pocket, a thought settled quietly upon him. In a village so devoted to civility and attentive observation, who had taken the trouble to guide, prompt, or test the community from the shadows, and to what precise end? The question, understated yet insistent, suggested that the evening's social was but one scene in a broader tableau of scrutiny, expectation, and carefully measured influence. The following morning, the vicarage study was bright with filtered sunlight, its polished surfaces reflecting the meticulous order of Reverend Hartwell's administrative world. Inspector Purbright arrived to observe the parish committee meeting, a gathering whose purpose was ostensibly procedural, but whose true interest lay in the subtle negotiations of hierarchy, expectation, and moral observation. Chairs had been arranged with precision, and the table bore neatly stacked papers, each sheet aligned as though awaiting scrutiny rather than casual review. Reverend Hartwell welcomed him with restrained cordiality. "Inspector Purbright, your presence is always appreciated, though I trust your attention will remain discreet. Committee meetings, while mundane to some, often revealed the quieter rhythms of our parish." Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed, Reverend. It is often in the silences, the hesitations, and the choice of phrasing that the most instructive observations emerge." Mrs. Penhaligon arrived first, hands folded in that familiar posture of vigilant civility. Her gaze swept the room, noting the alignment of papers and the positions of fellow members with an almost imperceptible precision. "I trust, Inspector, she said, "that attention will be paid to the proper sequence of reports. Deviations, however minor, may disrupt both understanding and decorum." "Certainly," Purbright replied, noting the subtext. A gentle assertion of authority, a subtle reminder of the hierarchy under which the committee operated. Mr. Grantham entered next, carrying his ledger as though it were both shield and instrument. He greeted the inspector with careful formality, then seated himself with a posture that communicated both attentiveness and control. His hands rested briefly upon the table, adjusting the placement of his papers before speaking. "I hope, Inspector, that your presence will not create undue pressure. Our proceedings are designed to maintain clarity, not to provoke anxiety." Purbright allowed a faint smile. Observation need not provoke. It simply permits one to perceive the interplay between stated intent and unspoken concern. Miss Hatherley, arriving last, took her seat at a discreet distance from the table, her attention sweeping the room like a lens. She nodded to Purbright, an acknowledgment of his presence and, perhaps, of shared awareness, yet she spoke little, allowing her gaze and posture to perform the social calculations that words might have interrupted. The meeting commenced with discussion of routine matters, hymn schedules, seating arrangements for the forthcoming Sunday service, and the allocation of flower duties. On the surface, the conversation was impeccably polite, each suggestion phrased as a form of communal benefit, each critique carefully hedged. Yet Purbright, noting the subtleties of phrasing, detected undercurrents of rivalry and discreet assertion of moral attention. Mrs. Penhaligon's comments, though courteous, carried the faint weight of expectation. "It would be advisable," she said, "that the sequence of duties follow the customary order. Such consistency reflects both attention and propriety." Her words implied adherence, yet in their gentleness concealed a subtle challenge, the suggestion that deviation had been observed and that vigilance remained warranted. Grantham, with measured politeness, responded, "Consistency is indeed desirable, yet one must also consider efficiency and circumstance. Observance of procedure is commendable, but flexibility may be necessary." His phrasing, precise and formal, suggested a negotiation of authority rather than direct challenge, a subtle assertion of judgment within the bounds of civility. Miss Hatherley, seated silently, occasionally tilted her head or adjusted her hands upon her lap. Though she offered no spoken remark, the minor gestures signalled careful attention to detail and implicit alignment with some comments over others. Purbright noted how her quiet comportment itself functioned as social commentary, attentiveness without overt intervention, influence without declaration. At a lull, Purbright observed a subtle exchange, a slip of a note passed discreetly beneath the table from one member to another. The movement was almost imperceptible, yet in his experience such interventions carried weight far beyond their size. He did not immediately examine the note, preferring to allow its presence to ripple through the room unnoticed, observing reactions. A faint tension appeared in Mrs. Penhaligon's hands. Grantham's brow creased briefly, a shadow of consideration. Miss Hatherley's eyes flickered just enough to register awareness. Civility remained intact, yet the undercurrent of scrutiny and concern had shifted. The note, though small and unassuming, was emblematic of the ongoing, silent choreography of observation in Little Hemsby. Each parishioner navigated a network of expectation and reputation where even minor interventions, gestures, notes, phrasing could reshape perception. Words, actions, and the deliberate withholding of action all served as instruments of subtle influence. Reverend Hartwell, noting the shift in demeanour among his committee, allowed the meeting to continue without comment, his presence a stabilizing yet quietly alert authority. Purbright, sitting slightly apart, observed the careful management of attention, each glance, each pause, each modulation of tone designed to preserve civility while negotiating moral and procedural authority. When discussion turned to the scheduling of morning duties, Purbright noted small contradictions. Mrs. Penhaligon's recommendation of order slightly conflicted with Grantham's proposed adjustments, and both were moderated by Miss Hatherley's attentive silence. These minor divergences were not overt disputes, but subtle assertions of intent, moral vigilance, and social expectation. Each participant maintained decorum while positioning themselves in the lattice of hierarchy and observation. As the meeting drew toward its formal conclusion, Purbright observed a brief, almost imperceptible gesture. Grantham adjusted a sheet of paper, revealing a small, folded note beneath. The movement was casual enough to avoid detection by most, yet in the context of prior observations, it suggested deliberate action. Purbright made a mental note. The anonymous interventions he had traced through newsletters, social events, and confessional spaces now appeared in live interaction within the committee itself. Reverend Hartwell rose to adjourn, expressing polite thanks for diligence and attentiveness. "Our proceedings," he said, "reflect the care and devotion of each participant. May we continue in both civility and conscientious attention." The words were gracious, yet Purbright detected an implicit acknowledgement. Vigilance, observation, and subtle influence remained ongoing. As the committee members departed, Purbright lingered. He examined the small note revealed by Grantham's gesture. The message was concise. Sequence observed, note deviations carefully. No signature, no further instruction, merely a reminder of oversight. The presence of the note, carefully placed, implied not censure but observation, an indication that attention was being maintained beyond formal channels. Walking through the quiet lanes toward the vicarage gate, Purbright considered the pattern emerging from his cumulative observations. Minor discrepancies in procedure, subtle divergences in gesture and phrasing, and the carefully placed notes that traversed the parish like invisible threads. Civility functioned as both shield and instrument, and within this network the locked chapel door had catalyzed a series of attentions, interventions, and silent inquiries. The inspector paused briefly at the vicarage gate, noting the alignment of hedges, the gentle placement of flower pots, and the faint echo of steps from the departing committee. Even here, minor deviations, an uneven placement of a pot, a tilt of a chair, spoke of observation, concern, and unspoken influence. The anonymous notes, delivered with precision and discretion, suggested a participant not formally recognized in parish hierarchy, yet exerting subtle guidance or surveillance. Purbright's thoughts settled on a quiet, insistent question. In a community so meticulously attentive to civility and moral propriety, who had assumed the role of subtle overseer, and to what end? The committee meeting had revealed not only alliances and divergences, but also the deliberate presence of an external agent within the lattice of observation, whose interventions, carefully calibrated, were beginning to shape behavior and expectation without overtly revealing themselves. As he walked down the lane, the afternoon light fading into soft evening, Purbright understood that the network of vigilance within Little Hemsby had shifted. Minor discrepancies, gestures, and anonymous notes had transformed the parish into a stage where observation, propriety, and subtle intervention intersected. The locked chapel door, once a trivial concern, had become a lens through which the social, moral, and procedural intricacies of the community could be perceived. The inspector allowed a final reflection to settle upon him. The mystery was no longer merely about access, or even about a door, but about attentiveness, authority, and the careful choreography of influence. And in this realization, one subtle yet persistent question emerged. Who guided the observation? Who placed the notes? And how far did their quiet influence extend? The following morning, Little Hemsby seemed unusually still, as though the village itself held its breath in quiet anticipation. Inspector Purbright, walking the familiar lanes with measured steps, reflected on the sequence of observations that had led him to this point. The locked chapel door, the newsletters, confessional nuances, parish social dynamics, and the anonymous notes now appearing with uncanny precision. Each episode had added a layer to the lattice of civility, scrutiny, and subtle influence. Now he sought to trace the origin of the quiet interventions themselves. He began at the vicarage, where Reverend Hartwell was arranging papers for a minor committee audit. The vicar's movements were deliberate, each sheet aligned, each notation placed with meticulous care. "Inspector," Hartwell said, glancing over the ledger, "one wonders whether the unseen hands in our community act for observation, guidance, or both. Civility, after all, need not imply passivity." Purbright inclined his head. "It seems," he replied, "that observation in Little Hemsby has acquired an autonomy of its own. The patterns suggest intention, yet the hand remains invisible, a silent presence that mediates propriety and expectation without overt intrusion." Hartwell smiled faintly. "Indeed. Some acts are performed for the benefit of conscience as much as for the observation of others. Yet I suspect, as you do, that the placement of notes and the timing of interventions indicate a mind carefully attuned to both ritual and discretion." The inspector spent the morning revisiting key locations: the chapel, the village hall, and the houses of Mrs. Penhaligon, Grantham, and Miss Hatherley. In each, he observed the subtle choreography of behaviour, slight adjustments in posture, hesitations in speech, and gestures of compliance that had previously escaped casual notice. Each minor divergence hinted at awareness, and the patterns were too consistent to be coincidental. The hand behind the notes was careful, informed, and intimately familiar with the rhythms of the parish. In the chapel, Purbright examined the locked door itself. Its mechanism was simple, yet the attention paid to its use had now acquired symbolic significance. Who had first noted it? Who had initiated the series of observations that cascaded into newsletters, confessions, socials, and committee meetings? And who ensured that each subsequent participant understood the weight of even minor deviations from propriety? A faint rustle drew his attention to the lectern, where a single folded note had been tucked under the hymnal, a repeat of the earlier pattern. Unfolded, it read, "Observe alignment. Integrity is reflected in attention." The handwriting was precise, deliberate, yet unfamiliar. The message suggested no malice, only vigilance and a quiet insistence upon order. Later in the village hall, Purbright arrived to find Miss Hatherley arranging chairs for an evening rehearsal of the choir. Her posture, though seemingly casual, conveyed both attention and purpose. She glanced at him briefly, not as a greeting, but as a measured acknowledgement of observation. Purbright noted that she had adjusted each chair with imperceptible precision, as though aware that someone, perhaps an unseen observer, would note the arrangement and assess adherence to a standard known only to the initiator. The inspector allowed himself a small smile. In a community devoted to civility, even the simplest gestures became instruments of scrutiny. Yet he remained mindful that the anonymous hand had not revealed itself directly, instead orchestrating behavior through notes, gestures, and subtle interventions. It was a form of influence that transcended direct authority, relying on anticipation, discretion, and social awareness. His attention shifted to Mrs. Penhaligon's residence, where the gardener's precision suggested a readiness to receive instruction or to comply with unseen standards. Purbright observed the alignment of flower beds, the spacing of borders, and the careful pruning of hedges. A note left delicately beneath a clay pot read, "Consistency is observed, deviations are instructive." The handwriting matched no known parishioner, and its placement indicated both knowledge of routine and confidence in the recipient's attention. Returning to the vicarage, Purbright was joined by Reverend Hartwell for afternoon tea. "It occurs to me," the vicar said, pouring with meticulous care, "that the parish has become self-regulating. Each participant anticipates observation, calibrates behaviour, and maintains propriety almost instinctively. Yet there is a presence orchestrating these attentions, subtle though it may be." Purbright sipped his tea. "Yes, the patterns suggest a mind not content merely to observe, but to guide. Anonymous notes, precise placement, and timing all indicate deliberate intervention, yet this agent remains unseen, preferring discretion over disclosure." A knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Miss Hatherley entered, her hands lightly clasped, eyes alert yet composed. She placed a folded note upon the table without word or comment, then withdrew with a faint nod. Purbright unfolded it carefully. The message was brief. "Those who observe must also consider discretion. Patterns are clearer when left unspoken." The inspector studied the phrasing. It implied awareness of his own attentions, acknowledgement of his observations, and subtly an invitation to deeper comprehension without confrontation. Whoever orchestrated these interventions possessed not only knowledge of parish routines, but also an appreciation for the psychology of vigilance and expectation. By late afternoon, Purbright had traced the network of observation as far as possible without direct confrontation. Each note, gesture, and adjustment was a thread in a lattice of moral attention, connecting newsletters, confessions, socials, and committee meetings. The locked chapel door had acted as a catalyst, revealing latent anxieties, rivalries, and conscientiousness. And at the centre of the lattice was a presence both meticulous and discreet, guiding the parish through subtle channels of influence. Walking the lane toward the chapel for one final inspection, Purbright considered the implications. Civility, reputational vigilance, and social expectation had converged in a quiet, patient mechanism of oversight. Yet the identity of the agent remained unconfirmed. Was it a parishioner particularly attuned to propriety? Someone who viewed moral oversight as a duty? Or a combination of both? At the edge of the chapel yard, Purbright noticed a small scrap of paper pinned beneath the gate latch. Its message, typed rather than handwritten, read, "Observation is itself a service. Continue attentiveness, further clarity follows." The simplicity of the phrasing, combined with its placement, indicated confidence, foresight, and the understanding that influence need not be overt to be effective. Purbright pocketed the note and paused, glancing at the chapel tower silhouetted against the setting sun. He reflected on the cumulative network he had observed: minor gestures, subtle divergences, polite admonitions, anonymous notes, and the pervasive awareness of reputational scrutiny. The village had transformed under this quiet influence, each participant engaged in a performance of civility that reinforced moral expectation without the need for direct enforcement. As he walked home through the amber light of evening, a thought settled upon him. The mystery was no longer one of a locked door or minor procedural lapses. It was a study of attentiveness, discretion, and social orchestration, a reminder that influence in Little Hemsby was neither public nor dramatic, but quiet, pervasive, and remarkably effective. And in that realization, a final question emerged, understated yet persistent. Who had assumed the role of silent observer, placing notes, guiding gestures, and orchestrating vigilance? And would that presence ever reveal itself fully, or remain content to shape the village through absence and suggestion alone? The answer as Purbright knew, would require patience, continued observation, and a sensitivity to the subtle currents of civility that governed this quietly intricate community. With that reflection, he passed beneath the low-hanging branches of the lane, each step measured, each glance catalogued, conscious that the unseen observer, patient, discreet, and judicious, remained a presence in every aligned chair, every folded newsletter, and every polite gesture of the village. The locked chapel door had long since ceased to be a mere object. It had become a symbol, a lens, and perhaps the most understated instrument of insight in Little Hemsby.